your DPS doesn't matter, or at least your main damage dealer themselves. Now, I know a lot of individuals do like to have the strongest character, but that's Embodied Lunai at the time, Kafka, Blade, Jingyuan, Danheng, his base 4-star variation, Silverwolf, Sealy, etc. But I think it's also important to realize that in this game, every new DPS has outpaced the previous one in some effect. And so at that point, it's also important to consider at what degree does that DPS increase matter to you? And is it realistically going to be a DPS increase for you to pull them? Because I do think a lot of us see big damage and are like, wow, that's great. I want that too. Because that does to some degree translate to an ease in terms of MOC. But I also want people to understand that a lot of that high damage potential has to be reached through high investment. And if you're equally spreading resources through multiple damage healers that require basically different relics, then your ceiling and the potential of your characters is arbitrarily lower because you can invest into all of them to the same degree. If you pulled for Blade, then Kafka, then also Danheng, and plan on pulling for Jingliu next, your resources are spread thin between each of these units because not only do you have to build them up, but you also have to farm relics for them, but you also then have to get a team for them. And even though someone like Embodied Lunai may have the highest potential, are you really going to reach that ceiling if you haven't invested and can't afford to invest into him as much as you would other units, or as much as you would be able to if you only pulled for him? I think it's important to consider that yes, unless a character is drastically, and I mean like 20 to 30% stronger than another unit, it's very unlikely that you yourself will notice the difference. And yes, there are some scenarios. Embodied Lunai may have an AoE that Sealy does not have. So yes, that can make a dramatic difference to your account, but if you have Blade, is it really necessary? And then you also need to consider what restrictions do they require? What prerequisites do you need to meet in order to reach that potential? Do you have the skill points? Do you have the artifacts? Do you have the speed requirements? Do you have the set to begin with? How bound are they to their light cone in particular? And because of these factors, yes, a character can look great on paper, and a character can look wonderful in a showcase, but you also need to consider, is it really viable for you to be able to reach that potential? If a character loses 20% damage by not having the signature, is it really worthwhile at that point for you to pull for that character without their signature? And I think that it's very easy to get caught up in the hype of a new damage healer. Jingliu is likely going to be a wonderful unit. But if you already have other destruction units who have an AoE to some degree and are already built, you likely won't need her. Because yes, a character can be strong. Yes, a character can be great and have really nice potential, but if you have to farm for ages to even reach a fraction of that damage, it's not worth it over your current damage healers unless you don't have a DPS that is adequate for you right now. When instead, the resources that you invest into a new DPS can instead be dragged over into a Tingyun, a Bailu, a Bronja, a Natasha, and so on. When you have characters that are supports, that are used in so many different variations of your teams, you get more value and mileage out of investing into these units. Even a Pela, a Welt, whoever the case may be, you get much more value from investing into these units because you likely won't change their relics. You're likely to use them in different areas. If you have a preservation unit like Japard, you can use him in a team where you don't have a healer. If you have a unit like Bailu, the same applies. If you have somebody like Bronya, you're likely going to use her with any damage healer. And so at that point, a DPS will only be used when they are needed to deal damage. But if you are in a team to where you are not needing them, they have lost all value. In comparison to a Tingyun or anyone else who legitimately can bring value to any team because they're slid into any team. The only character who doesn't benefit from Tingyun is a Blade. You also need to consider skill point usage and how efficient your team can be to actually funnel the damage into them. Do they require speed tuning? Yes or no? Are you able to accomplish that yourself? I think that the vast majority of us do understand Embodied Lunai may as a character be stronger than Jingyuan, and Blade and Kafka, but is it viable for a lot of people to pull for him specifically for that? And yes, there are situations in which one character will dramatically outperform another. For instance, if the enemy is weak naturally to that element. But in that same vein, even though that enemy is weak to, let's say hypothetically it's Ice and you have Jingliu, she may be wonderful against that enemy. And let's say your only other damage healer is a Danheng Embodied Lunai. Then in that instance, yes, Jingliu might be better for you, but at the same time, can we also admit that Silverwolf as a unit can make another character more viable? Do you need AoE? No or yes? And in that instance, a support Silverwolf would hold more value to your account because she allowed you to use a character you already have invested without having to invest into another character. And in contrast to Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail is all about hypercarry teams. It's all about buffing your DPS to the max. It's all about having a Tingyun who buffs attack, a Yukon Wukong who buffs crit, a Bailu to keep you alive. Because of this, your DPS matters a lot, but your support matter far more because they're the ones doing the buffing to begin with. They're the ones allowing you to reach that potential, whether it's a Pela or so on. Genshin is opposite. It's about the reactions your team has, so the elements matter a bit more. But because Honkai Star Rail is a team building game, and because it's about building a hyper carry and buffing your DPS to the max potential, I can understand where a lot of people get caught up in the idea that your DPS needs to be absolutely wonderful. But I would also like to remind you that if your supports are garbage, if they aren't surviving, or even if they are but barely have enough gear on them to fully buff, or barely have enough investment into the talents to actually buff your characters, then that DPS increase won't matter because you would get far more damage just by building the supports up. So all in all, yes, I understand that characters like Mbappe Lunai and Jingliu and so on, even Topaz, may be wonderful and may be incredibly useful for your account. But I also don't want people to get caught up into the idea that the newest damage dealer or even the strongest damage dealer currently listed is the best choice for them. When instead, if you have supports that are underutilized, underbuilt, it may be a good idea just to get them to a point where they're usable in case you need them in the future. Because supports can usually gap fill a lot of areas that you don't otherwise have abilities and characters to fix. Whether it's Welt to imprison opponents, which can help a lot with imaginary units getting their set working. Or Pela, who can reduce the defenses of your enemies but also remove big buffs from them, including their revival buff on opponents. Bronya, who boosts your crit damage, allows an enemy to take an instant action, and so on. Supports usually offer a bit more utility and it can in some cases be a bit better investment for your account than a new damage dealer, because unless that new DPS is going to have the light cone and it's going to have an optimal team set up for them, it'd be a lot better for you to skip that DPS or maybe even skip the next one and invest into a support, whether the preservation, abundance, harmony, nihility, and so on. Because if a character requires a specific team comp to get working, and that team comp would otherwise take units from another team you're using, maybe it's a good idea to reconsider. Characters like Blade, who have natural tankiness and otherwise use a set that is in a good domain, are going to offer a little bit more value than a character like Den Heng, who don't necessarily have that tankiness, require a lot of skill points, and whose other domain, that being the imaginary domain, isn't that useful for a lot of you. Meanwhile, supports like Silverwolf, Lorcha, and Fu Xuan can offer a little bit more value to your account by comparison, because they're not only in decent domains, but subsequently are also more flexible for your account. But hey, that's just my opinion. I summoned for Jing Yuan, and yes, I do regret it, but he's a cool character, so I am a little bit miffed and not necessarily as unhappy as it otherwise would be. But I also have Blade, Kafka, and Mbappe Lunai. So I can understand that people do want the coolest or the strongest character, but my Sealy has held on long term for such a long time. I'm a Yanqing main, despite the fact that many people don't see him in the background. So I just think investing heavily into a DPS you love or a DPS you already have is far more valuable than investing into the newest one who's a slight damage increase, unless that newest one is offering a larger marginal utility to your account than another character is. But also consider the risk. If your character is needing the same mats as support is using, or same mats as a previous DPS, you're likely to spend a lot more time farming than you are using them. And if you spend a whole patch farming for that DPS, then it's not really that big of an increase because MOC will favor the next DPS after. But hey, that's just my opinion. Tell me yours. Do you have the newest damage dealer? Do you oftentimes pull for the strongest character? Or have you just been happy with a character you legitimately enjoy the personality of? I think Yanqing is cute. That's why I use him. Either way, subscribe and I'll see you next time.